The LOI is one of the most misunderstood steps in the small business buying process. It's not a purchase agreement, but it's also not just another piece of paper. It can make or break your deal before due diligence even starts. In this video, I'll cover what an LOI actually is, key terms you have to know and how I structured my LOI, how it differs from a purchase agreement, and what most first-time buyers miss. So what is an LOI? LOI stands for a letter of intent. It's a non-binding outline of the deal structure, which includes your agreement on price, basic terms, due diligence period, exclusivity period. It's basically your option to dig deeper into the business and figure out if it's a right fit for you, and gives you the exclusive right to perform due diligence. Now, this is different from a purchase agreement, which is a binding agreement. I'll say some business brokers will try to skip the LOI process and go directly to a purchase agreement and get the buyer to sign that. I would say don't do that. Always go with an LOI. Some brokers are very aggressive and will try to bully you around to get you to sign the purchase agreement up front. There are some buyers who will do that, but I just personally don't think it's a great idea. It means you have to start basically incurring legal costs from the beginning without even going through due diligence, because you'll ultimately want a lawyer to review this contract since it's binding. And it's also more difficult to get out of in case something comes up during the due diligence period that you just don't like. Don't let the business brokers bully you around. There were a few businesses that I encountered that I really liked and I wanted to submit an LOI, and the business brokers would say, hey, we're not accepting LOIs. We're going directly to purchase agreement. And for me, that was a non-starter, and I ultimately had to walk away. So make sure to keep your emotions in check. So why the LOI matters more than people think. It sets expectations before emotions get involved. It protects your time, money, and resources during the due diligence period. It prevents surprises when the purchase agreement does get drafted. But it also helps your lender understand the deal structure at its basic terms while showing the seller that you are committed and organized. A sloppy LOI leads to a very messy purchase agreement. A clean LOI just makes everything easier for all parties involved. So what are the key components of a strong LOI, and what did I include for each of these components in the LOI that I offered? Each of these terms could have its own video, which I could do in the future. So I will keep this as high level as possible. Now, first up, and probably the most important component, especially to the seller, is the purchase price. Now, the purchase price should be based on seller discretionary earnings, or SDE. And I think you should tie a multiple to it. Not every buyer does that, but it's something I did and I think it's important. And the reason for that is, let's say, for example, you submit your LOI and the price based on 3 times SDE. You get through due diligence, financial due diligence, and you find out, hey, SDE was actually $50,000 less than what the seller represented. You kind of now have some leverage to renegotiate and say, I made this offer based on 3 times SDE, and I'm still willing to offer that, but the SDE is $50,000 less, and so we need to adjust the price. It just gives you a little bit more leverage than just including an absolute value without any multiple. Now, I won't get too deep into working capital right now, but I think it's just important to know that it's basically the cash required to have on hand to run the day-to-day operations and cover day-to-day expenses like payroll and inventory. A lot of the times, I'd say even most of the times, the sellers will not include working capital, and you'll be required to bring your own. And what you want to try to do before submitting your LOI is find out from the seller how much working capital is needed in order to run the business. So in my example, I said, hey, how much cash do you need to keep on hand on a month-to-month basis in order to cover your expenses while you wait for revenue to come in? So I included that in the LOI, and then it also included something in the clause, which I think is helpful to say, hey, based on my discussions with the seller, he thinks I need X amount of working capital, and that's what I plan on bringing. And anything materially over that, the seller will bridge the gap. The next component is the deal structure and how is the seller getting paid. The first part of this will be the cash at close. And this will include how much cash you're bringing, as well as how much is being financed. You don't need to outline that separately, because ultimately the bank is bringing that cash to the seller, and that's just what the seller cares about. He just cares about the fact that the money is coming to him at close. And then you'll also want to include any seller financing, which may or may not be included. Standard in the market is about 5 to 10% seller financing, and you'll want to be sure you include key terms like the interest, the length of the term, is it amortizing, is there a balloon payment at the end of that term. I was fortunate enough to get 20% seller financing, which proves that the seller is confident in this business and is confident that, he can train myself to run this business and also make sure we have a smooth transition period. Now, I personally would not purchase a business without any sort of seller financing, even if it's something small like 5%. It shows that the seller is confident in the business and continues to have skin in the game to make sure he gets his full payout. And lastly, you'll want to include any performance-based components. In my LOI, I include a seller note that is forgivable based on SDE margin being at least 20% for the 12 months after closing. The margins are typically at 25%, so the seller was more than open to it. And it was just a way for me to protect myself because there were a couple of things in the financials that I was okay with, but I just wanted to find a way to mitigate it. And this was one way to do it. And fortunately, the seller was open to it because he is confident and comfortable with the business and that it will continue running smoothly and generating profit. Not all deals will have this component. Now, next up will be the transition and training period. You should include how long the seller will be helping train you and transitioning the business over to you. You want to start this length as long as possible, at the 90, 120 days, and hopefully the seller can agree to that. You want to do that because you don't know how much time it's going to take you to be able to get fully up to speed on the business. Let's say you agree to 90 days and then 30 days in, you're like, hey, I understand this business. I can run this on my own. I no longer need the seller. You can cut that short, but it's harder to extend that time period. So I say start with a longer period. Now, you'll also want to include whether it's paid or unpaid support. In my opinion, I think it should be unpaid for at least 30 to 90 days. You're giving that seller a large sum of money for that business, and to help you continue running that business efficiently, there should be unpaid support for at least 30 to 90 days. And then you also want to include the availability during that time period. Is it full-time? Is it part-time? Is it just remotely consulting? In my example, it's 90 days full-time, and then 90 days where the seller is available for any phone calls or any remote consulting. We can send them emails if we have any questions, those sorts of things. Now, the next component is the exclusivity period. This is basically saying the seller cannot continue to shop his business around during this period and while you're doing due diligence. Usually you get 45 to 90 days, but I think you should try to tie this directly to the due diligence period. I was able to get 90 days exclusivity period to match the 90 days due diligence period. I'll say this is the one binding term, unlike the rest of the LOI. Overall, it protects you as the buyer. It allows you to complete your due diligence period in peace without worrying about the seller shopping around the deal, seeing if they can find a higher bidder, while also allowing you to spend the money and resources you need to get through the due diligence. Now, that leads into the next one, which is the due diligence scope. During this time period, the business and the seller are completely open to you for you to fully review that business and figure out if this is truly a good fit for you. You should be able to ask many questions as you want versus the pre-LOI period when you're probably limited to about 5 to 7 of the most important questions. I say you want at least 30 days, ideally 90 days. I was fortunate that I was able to get 90 days in mine. And I'll reiterate, as in prior videos, the due diligence comprises of 3 key components, and that is legal, operational, and financial. And it's also split among 2 different segments, informal and formal due diligence. In the next video, I'll get into the informal due diligence, which is currently where I'm at right now with my deal. Now, the next key term will be whether this is an asset sale or a stock sale. The asset sale is most typical in this space, given it's cleaner, while a stock sale means purchasing the entire entity with all of its liabilities, which can be a little bit more complex. For an asset sale, you want to be sure to include what assets are included. That will be equipment, vehicles, inventory, IP, customer list, websites, and anything else needed to run the business. You'll also want to lay out what's excluded. For example, the seller could have a vehicle that is on the business payroll that he wants to keep. So that would be something that's excluded. In my case, it's an asset sale and includes all assets currently owned by or being used to operate the business. So nothing is excluded. Now, the next term will be the target closing date. And typically you want to try to align this with the due diligence and exclusivity period. So it'll be 60 to 90 days, although it could be more towards the 90 days if SBA is involved, just given that can take 60 days in itself, or it could be shorter if it's an all cash deal, and it could be longer if it's a more, complex deal. This helps align all parties involved. The lender, the broker, the buyer, the seller, the attorney work towards one goal, one target closing date. It sets the expectation for a timeline. And for my deal, I was able to get this at 90 days. Now, the last term I'll go over is the confidentiality and the non-compete clauses. These are sometimes included or sometimes separate and just included in the purchase agreement. I think it's a great idea to include in the LOI if you can. The confidentiality clause prevents the seller from sharing your terms with other prospective buyers in order to try to get a better deal. And the non-compete covenant prevents the seller from starting the exact same type of business immediately after close and competing with you directly. This is typically at least 5 years, which is what I set for mine. And I think that's the requirement by the SBA. Now, I'll end this video saying I am not an attorney and none of what I've laid out in this video is legal advice. This is all just my opinion and what I think you should do in your LOI. Now, you may ask yourself, how do I start an LOI? Is there a template? And yes, there are plenty of templates and honestly free resources online if you Google LOI small business template. The other thing you can do is you can speak with your attorney that you'll likely have to hire later during due diligence anyways and see if they have an LOI template you can use. The LOI does not need to be 10 pages long. It should be relatively short. My LOI, for example, was only 3 pages and it had everything it needed. Once your LOI is accepted, you can start requesting documents from the seller for your due diligence. In my next video, I'll cover the due diligence process and in particular, the informal due diligence process, which is currently where I'm at in my deal and what you should be looking at before you start spending money on your deal.